Hello, everyone, and happy Sunday to every one of you. Thank you for coming over for this lovely session of web development with Angular by Mr. Gray Lewis. I see that there are 73 participants already joined. Just quickly want to check before I start. Can we have a quick update on chat? If you can just put yes, if you can hear me loud and clear. All right. Okay. I see a lot of yeses already. Okay. Guys, before we get started and just wait for maybe next 30 seconds while we wait for a few more people to join in, just wanted to understand your expectations. If you can just put it in one line each from your side regarding what are your expectations from today's session. So you can just put one line on the chat regarding your expectations. Quickly, guys. Come on. All right, getting started with Angular. Any one project. Okay. Understanding enhanced skills. Web development 101. Okay. All right. Get to know how to get started. All right. Okay. Good knowledge about mean stack. All right. All right. Great. So, in if I have to just pick up an average question here, out of all these questions which are coming up, so most of us are here to just get a hang of it, or getting started, or rather getting to understand what exactly is Angular and the web development. So yes, you have landed at a perfect place, Eduonix Learning Solutions. Here you will be trained by one of our experts, industry experts, Mr. Gray Lewis, who is already with me, and he will be starting very shortly. I just wanted to understand what all your expectations so that he can go through it. And of course, we'll try and answer almost all the questions in our later Q&A rounds, which we have at the end of the session. So next 90 minutes, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be one fabulous session with Gray. Gray has been a very good colleague of mine. I have enjoyed previous sessions as well, and I'm sure you will be having a good time understanding what he has. Guys, one question, one ground rule I'm placing across for everyone. We are keeping the chat open for each and every one of us. Let's make sure that we're keeping all the questions related to it parked right towards the end of the session, towards the last half of the session, towards the Q&A round, or if Gray asks you any questions, you can put them across on the chat. Second thing is, one good thing today is we are actually giving away free giveaways during this session. So stay tuned, don't go away. You will definitely benefit out of it. So there is one giveaway as well. And also there are a few good things which are coming up with Eduonix, which I would like to share during the session. So without taking any much of time, I see that we have exactly 100 people, participants. Thank you so much. Spending time on a Sunday is difficult, I know, but yes, you have made it a point to attend this session. Thank you. You have taken the right step. So let's get started. Gray, I'll hand over the mic. Gray, are you there?
Yes, thank you for that fantastic introduction.
All right, great. I'll go on mute. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is having a really good day today. Um, Give me 1 second to quickly share this presentation for you guys. Um, so today we are covering Angular. A lot of you, I assume, have some familiarity at least with what the idea behind Angular is. But if you don't, essentially what Angular is going to let us do is sort of abstract away from all of these really nitty-gritty details that we used to have to deal with, back in like 2010 when we were dealing with creating single-page web applications, and really lets us focus on the flow of data and how the UI will react to that data as you progress interacting through the application. So as my colleague brilliantly introduced me, I don't have to go too in depth, but yeah, my name is Gray Lewis. I am a full stack web engineer. I have been working in the field since I was about 16. So about 5 years now, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys, give you a little taste of what Angular is like, and yeah, I'm so glad to see so many of you showing up, and yeah, let's dive right in. So basically, one important thing I want to get out of the way right up front is if you have a familiarity with Angular, then this webinar probably isn't going to be very interesting for you. I'm really going to be focusing on the absolute fundamentals. I'm going to be trying to give you guys a lot of time to ask questions, to really make sure that you guys truly understand exactly what each piece of this app we're going to be building today is. It's a very simple app. We will be basically creating a one-page clock application that will display the time for us. But we're going to be using a data-driven like system really for keeping that clock in sync with real time. And in doing so, we'll be able to cover a lot of um, what fundamentally makes Angular what it is, these fundamental concepts and mechanisms that that define how we work with Angular. So a little bit of Angular history. What we currently call Angular now is actually quite transformed from what Angular was in its original release, which is why there's actually two different versions of Angular that you can currently use. One is called Angular JS, and one is called Angular. Angular JS is the predecessor to Angular. And I remember when I was first getting interested in web development, one of the first things that I tried to learn was a Code Academy course, which is a website that maybe some of you have used before, that was working with Angular JS, so this deprecated older version of Angular. And the original idea behind Angular was essentially to provide a really intuitive and sort of flexible system for creating HTML templates based on data. And we've seen now, ever since the rewrite of Angular JS into Angular 2 in 2015, a switch into a componentized structure. So Angular nowadays is a lot more comparable to other mainstream web frameworks like React, with some key differences and some key advantages as well. And there are a lot of varying opinions about which of these web frameworks is ultimately the best. But there are a lot of really avid Angular fans out there that you will find. And I think you guys will see some of why those people have so many good things to say about Angular. So first of all, we have this componentized architecture. If you've ever built in web applications before, you'll know that it's very hard to keep your code dry when writing in vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And what that means is we don't want to repeat ourselves. We don't want to rewrite the same code twice. What componentization allows us to do is create these little bundles of code that operate as their own sort of pieces of the UI, of the user interface, that we can repeat as many times as we need, and basically allow us to, avoid having to rewrite code over and over again when it comes to handling building UI components and connecting those to the backend, to the data flow that's going to influence it. One other really key important feature / pattern in Angular is this library called RxJS. So if any of you are familiar with JavaScript, which I assume a good amount of you are, if you're interested in learning how to do Angular, you'll know that typically when we want to work with asynchronous code, we will use something called promises or asynchronous functions, both of which essentially work the same. RxJS gives us sort of a different paradigm to view asynchronous tasks through. And it allows us to replace sort of event-driven functionality and asynchronous functionality with a much cleaner system of observables. So essentially what we'll be doing is creating these data streams in a way that any component can subscribe to. So if anyone here has done work with React before, you'll know how frustrating it is to get the right pieces of our application's state, of our application's data to the right component. And this is going to give us a really simple solution for that. One other really big advantage is the fact that Google supports Angular. So the fact that Google engineers are constantly keeping Angular up to date and ensuring that it's as fast and as efficient as it possibly can be means that in terms of open source projects, we have a lot of stability. And the other thing that's great about that is they can actually increase the scope of the project, because what you'll find is in a lot of open source projects, keeping the scope of the project quite small is super important to keeping the project maintainable, to making sure that it can be run effectively under open source governance. And the fact that Google is this huge organization with a huge amount of resources means that not only Google is going to dedicate enough resources to tackle exactly what Angular needs to accomplish as a library, but also that other companies are also going to be willing to dedicate their resources, knowing that Google is going to give this long-term support. And so we do see that Angular tends to be quite stable and have quite a bit of developer backing in the open source world. It's also quite performant. So, when considering, just how abstracted and complex Angular is, it really is quite an efficient and quick system that has been optimized as much as it can. And a lot of that comes down to a lot of its tooling, which is that last item on this bullet list here. The productivity software that comes bundled with Angular sort of makes sure that the fastest, most optimized version of our code is run on production every time. So we have a lot of things like optimized bundling and tree shaking. Things like this are really by default configured in Angular, so it saves us a lot of time that we would otherwise have to spend configuring something like Webpack, for example. And you'll see that that's a very common theme in AngularJS. They have this ecosystem of supporting libraries that typically we would actually have to accomplish with some other third-party library, but they're going to do that for us with really sensible defaults that are really easy to use and actually work quite well. So, and it is also cross-platform. Much like React, we have this ability to actually use libraries to port our Angular applications into native applications using a library called Ionic. And that's a super useful tool. A lot of companies have been moving in that direction. You'll see it with the Slack desktop application, as well as many others. And yeah, it's a super useful thing to only have to handle one code base at a time. It really increases the stability and predictability of all of the code bases that we would have to manage otherwise. So what are we going to be doing today then? Like I said, we're going to be building a very simple clock app. We're going to be dealing with some routing. So we'll be talking about how Angular actually handles responding to the URL that you visit, right? How it handles the configuration of different pages on your website. We're going to be talking about the component structure, how to define and create components. And that's also going to tie in with the Angular client, which is a powerful tool that will really give us a lot of really nice and simple shortcuts for creating boilerplate and the structure of our app. And then additionally, we'll be seeing how we can use Angular services to effectively hook up all these data flows that we need. In this case, it's a very simple data flow, right? Just the flow of what time it is into our actual app. But you can imagine in a more complex application, the amount of data that we would have to handle would be a lot more complicated. And services allow us to keep that task quite simple, quite maintainable, and quite consistent throughout our app. And as I said, we'll be seeing exactly how Angular handles these sensible defaults. If you are familiar with the React ecosystem, Angular has built-in equivalents to things like React Router, things like having to configure some sort of CSS pre-processing as well. all of these different annoying tasks that come with setting up the tooling, setting up the configuration for our app, Angular will handle for us. And there's a few important notes here for people who are just familiar with vanilla JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. So if you're coming into this without very much familiarity with the web framework ecosystem, then it's important to recognize that we'll actually be writing in a super set of JavaScript maintained by Microsoft called TypeScript, which you've almost definitely heard about before. Basically, we're going to be able to enforce some type checking on our code, and that is a default in Angular. We'll also be dealing with RxJS, which we touched on a little bit earlier, but it's important to note that there might be some unfamiliar syntax in certain places. If that comes to be, unfortunately, RxJS is quite a complex library, and I'll only be able to cover those few specific pieces that we'll be taking advantage of. But there is a lot to learn about all of the different tools and options that RxJS has for handling asynchronous tasks. And yeah, we'll see a bit of that during the demo. And then additionally, it's important to note that we'll be writing an SCSS. And if you don't know what that is, it's essentially a preprocessor that compiles down into CSS. So it has these fancy syntaxes and simplifications for all of these annoyances that you might have run into while having to write raw CSS. But it will actually be able to translate that slightly higher order style sheet into actual CSS. So it will end up not having any performance impact on our final website. Right, so before we get into the actual questions and stuff, let's get started with the demonstration. Let me get my screen shared properly here. There we are. Oh, and also one thing I want to show you guys quickly is the actual app that we will have when we're complete. Let me get that open here. So I assume you guys can see this cute little application we have here. It's very basic. It just says clock app and displays the time. But as you'll see, this is quite a scalable approach. So this is sort of an over-engineered solution to quite a simple problem. But you'll see that indeed, this is quite a powerful foundation for all of the different tools we'll end up needing to use in Angular. And hopefully this example will be quite helpful to you guys. So yeah, let's get into the coding demonstration now. I assume everyone is able to see my VS Code window here. We are working in VS Code, a very nice IDE that is very popular with JavaScript and TypeScript developers. And the first thing that we'll be doing here is going to use the Angular client. So if you want to try to code along with me, by the way, it's important that you go to the Angular website and install all of this software. It's pretty easy to find. Just Googling Angular should get you to the page you need to be at. But basically, the Angular CLI has a bunch of useful tools for initializing, setting up, and even actually creating the code for Angular applications. So if we just go ng new, what we'll be doing is creating a new application using the Angular client. So I'm going to name it clock application. It's going to ask us some questions here. Do we want strict type checking? Always answer yes if you can, or if you can handle it, I guess. Really, one thing I want to try to do actually is the option minimized? I'm going to try to. One important thing to recognize here is that the Angular ecosystem by default includes some testing, some unit testing libraries. And essentially what that's going to do is it's minimal. That's the option. It's a lot of really annoying default boilerplate. And when you actually have a production application, it's of course important to do unit testing if you're reaching that kind of scale. But at this point, when we're just learning, we don't really want to worry ourselves with exactly what the particulars of implementing unit testing and all of those things would be. So that's why I'm using this minimal option to avoid making all of that boilerplate. I'm going to name the application clock app, like we said. I'm going to opt into strict type checking. I'm also going to add Angular routing. As we said, this is one of those sensible defaults that comes with Angular. And we'll be able to use a really simple system, as you'll see, to define our routes and define how the URLs relate to which components and which pieces of our application will be rendered. And here we have the CSS pre-processing options. You'll see that they actually allow us to choose from some options, which is great. I think I and most people at this point working in the JavaScript ecosystem prefer SCSS. And what's great about that is SCSS allows us to use normal CSS syntax, so we don't have to learn any new rules or any new anything that new other than the things that build on top, like these extra tools. So much like TypeScript, SCSS is sort of a superset, an expanded set of syntaxes for writing CSS in much the same way TypeScript is for JavaScript. While I'm waiting for this this workspace to initialize, I see someone is asking what you need to download to install. Since we have this extra bit of time while this installs, I'll go ahead and send the link into chat. If you just go to this website, angular.io, you'll see that it's quite easy to get started. If you hit that get started link on the front page, you will be taken to the documentation. And then if you go to the get started guide in the documentation, which I'm sending the link for in the chat now, you will find just about everything you need to know. You will already have to have Node Package Manager installed, but it's quite a straightforward process, just installing using the global tag. And then, yeah, it's quite simple. Then you'll have the Angular client. As you'll see, sometimes these Angular tools do end up taking a while to run. It's pretty typical, pretty normal, especially because, as we said, Angular handles so much of these sensible defaults. You're seeing now it's generated quite a substantial set of boilerplate for us, which we can start taking a look around while it installs our node packages. Here is that routing module I talked about. And I think one thing to note with Angular is it can be a bit jarring to start with Angular, right? Like be on your first step in Angular and have so many files to familiarize yourself with, right? But just know that it's really okay. We don't have to really understand how all of these files work. If any of you have worked on an Android application before, you'll know what I'm talking about, where sometimes you don't need to know every single piece of the system to get something working, right? We can focus on the pieces we need. So don't get too intimidated by all of these different files here. We're going to be focusing on the routing for now. This is the routing module, and you'll see that it's a very simple sort of syntax for declaring routes. All we're going to have to do is declare one route, because we're only going to have one page on our application here. And the routes object accepts, or the routes array accepts an array of objects. So what we'll be doing here is creating an object with two properties. The first property will be path. So basically, this is going to be the sort of string that we will render this page on, right? So if I go to any web page in this circumstance, because I'm using this wildcard tag here, right? This wildcard, any page will be rendering the component clock component, which we haven't created yet, because we've been waiting for this to finish setting up. But now we can go ahead and create it now that the NPM has finished installing. To create a new component in Angular, it's quite a simple task. We go ng gc, right? So this is a shortcut for ng generate component, I believe. So we're going to go ng gc, and that's going to create the new component. And then we give it a name. We will call it the clock component. component, which I believe we would just do like that. Oh, I see. We have to enter our, there we go. So now we'll see that it is quickly going to generate the actual boilerplate for this little component here. And you'll see that there's only one file here. Like I said, since we're using the minimized option, what that really means, minimal option rather, what that means is that it won't be generating quite everything that the default Angular project would generate. Typically, we would expect there to be a SCSS file for every single component, right? So we have styles that are declared for each individual component. Here you see that there is a template declared for each individual component, right? So we're really creating almost a mini web page, right? Like a mini little piece of web content that is self-contained, right? It has its own styles, it has its own HTML associated with it, and it even has its own logic, its own data associated with it, its own state. If we go ahead and get started here, what we'll do, the first thing that we'll do inside of this clock component is to add an SCSS file, since we don't have that generated by default. You'll see here that we have this array of styles. All we have to do is go like this, .scss, and then as well create the actual file, clock.component.scss. Note that there is these nice naming conventions here to kind of keep our code organized. That .component sort of piece of the names of these files really helps to clarify what each piece is and how it relates to each other. But yeah, we'll see now that it's actually a nice little URL here, but this means that now it should allow us to apply these styles. So the next thing we have to do is start with our template. So I'm going to be doing just a very simple piece of HTML in place of this. Also here, what I will do as well is we can take a look at how an Angular component looks like by default. And let's take a look at exactly what we have so far. Right now, what I'm doing is running ngserve. Let me quickly share my screen. Share this terminal, the CMD window, so you guys can see. So we're in the folder of the actual application. I'm going to go into the actual folder that we're currently in, and then I'm going to go ngserve. So that's how we're going to actually start our application. Oh, sorry, one more directory to navigate there. So if we hit ngserve, this will actually handle the launching of the server for our web application, and by default, it's going to take us to localhost at port 4200, so 4200. You'll see it's compiling everything for us right now. We will let that sort of run for a sec while it gets started. And in the meanwhile, go back to the VS Code window. So I assume you guys can see my VS Code window now. What we need to do is we need to actually create the HTML that we're going to inject our data into, right? So first of all, as you saw in the original, what I'm going to do is be creating a logo. Yeah, so we're going to create the logo. We're going to create the little clock piece there. And inside of that clock element, we will need to inject our data. But before we do that, we are going to need to actually import these components. So an important thing to know about Angular is that you will have to manually sort of import all of these things to connect them together, right? Because as we said, they're sort of atomized. What I mean by that is self-contained, right? And so the nice thing about the Angular tooling is that in VS Code by default, it can automatically import for us, which is great. Yes, by just typing the clock component name, we are able to get that nice import statement, and now we have connected the things together. So if we now go to the browser, we should be able to see that we have effectively done the boilerplate for the beginning of this application. If we go ahead and share that screen, we'll see, yes, indeed, here is exactly what we expect. We have the, we have this web page, we have the default Angular screen. So this is exactly what Angular has by default. We'll see where that comes from in the code, this little default page and the links here. But we'll also see this little piece of text here at the bottom that says clock works. And we will recognize that from the component, right? From that little paragraph tag in the template of our component, our clock component. So let's go back to VS Code and take a look now at where all these pieces of HTML and CSS are coming from. So if we go to the app module, this is sort of the bigger picture declaration thing, just an important file to note. It's important that you should know that all of these things are imported as well in here. So this sort of connects, it's the glue that sort of defines all of the pieces and lets everything know where it is, right? And then we have the component itself. So that is sort of the manifest in a way. And then we have the actual app component, right? So here we have a template that is defined at the root level. You'll see that if I go ahead and delete all of this boilerplate, we'll be left with one element called router outlet. And that router outlet element is exactly where our component is being injected, because you'll remember in the routing module, we defined the relationship between what route we're on and what component is rendered, right? That relationship is interpreted and then rendered inside of this sort of fake, or not really fake, but really it's not meant to be, it's purely structural. It doesn't actually add anything to the web page. This is a structural element that is going to handle the routing. So what that means is we could, for example, have an element that appears on every web page, and then a piece of the page that is sort of conditionally added based on what the URL is. So you can imagine that's useful for things like navigation bars, etc. But yes, so now we sort of understand, we can see some of the actual markup and things that are being rendered in our Angular application. But now let's see where this actual, how this component actually plays into this, right? So we saw that clock works text was being rendered at the bottom of the page. And we can see that here that is, right? That's exactly where that's coming from. So if we just replace this HTML with any HTML, at this point, it should be rendered, right? So what I'm going to do is I will be taking the markup from the app and just pasting it in. I don't want to waste too much time talking about HTML or CSS, because that's slightly, I think, beginner for this this webinar. But I'll just be pasting in the actual HTML here. We'll see that we have a logo, which is, I mean, you saw the web page, you know, that text at the top. Then we have a container for the actual clock, and then a container for the time, and then a span that has the actual time injected into it. Inside of here, we see a interesting notation that we may not be familiar with. And this is how Angular interpolates data into the markup. So this .current time is referencing the actual class clock component that we have defined down here. Obviously, it's not currently actually defined, but once we do define it, that's how we'll inject it. And to take advantage of that and to actually assign a value to that number, we're going to have to declare it as a property of this class. So we'll initialize it using this syntax. And here is where our first piece of TypeScript knowledge is going to come in. If you're not familiar with TypeScript, this will be an unfamiliar syntax for you. But this is essentially a declaration of types in TypeScript. So we have it as current time string undefined. I'm not exactly sure why it's not getting syntax highlighted in the way that I'm used to, but it's fine. So we are saying this can either be a string or it can be undefined. And the reason it needs to be able to be undefined is because when someone loads the web page, we don't know what time it is, right? So the initialized value will have to be undefined until that actual data comes in to tell us, and it will still be instant. But we have to allow it to be undefined for that brief moment. And yeah, so these are the allowed types that this value can be assigned to. And that's what we mean by type checking. We are enforcing that certain variables are a certain type of value, in this case, strings or undefined for this variable. And then now we need to create the actual data service. And this is one of the more complex things. Oh, actually, before I do that, I will quickly give the disclaimer that I'm also not going to be running too much through the SCSS, the visual markup that makes up this page, because again, I think that's just a little bit too beginner for something about a web framework, right? But you can see it's not all that much CSS. It's just 66 lines. I've also declared some variables here. I like doing this when I do SCSS or any markup or any style sheets, really. Just declaring exactly what colors I like, giving them names, and then using those variables instead of the actual hexadecimal values. What we'll see is that means that we can really easily change up our color scheme, right? So I could just change this variable and change all of that. So I always try to come at it with a color scheme ahead of time. And then, yeah, just some very basic things in terms of centering it on the page, making it look a certain way. We're giving it the font Space Mono, which is a font that I'm a big fan of. And to enable that Space Mono font, what we're going to do is include this little line in the index.html from Google Fonts. If you've done any web development where you had to use custom fonts, you're somewhat familiar probably with how to link together fonts as a style sheet in the index.html. So these two links will actually give us access to that Space Mono font. It's completely free, hosted by Google, no problem whatsoever. So yes, now we have the markup mostly done. We just got to actually now sort of define a few specific things about how we want it to function, right? So oh, also the one other thing I have to mention as well. We're back here in this component page where we linked our SCSS. It's important to note that actually in the current form that we have it right now, we are getting these styles are not being interpreted as locations for style sheets, but as actual CSS. So by changing it to style URLs, we will now be actually importing the SCSS as its own file. That was just a little mess up on my part. But yeah, so now it's an array of URLs essentially, right? Of files on my system that contain the information to style the HTML associated with the template that we've defined right up here. So now if I save that and hit refresh on my output, we can go over to Google Chrome and see that indeed some of it is working now. We notice that it's not looking exactly how we're expecting it to. There's a few reasons for that. One, because we are missing the actual data to display. And one of the things that we had in the original application was a global style for the background of the page. So going back into our VS Code again, we have this file called styles.css. It's right here in the root of our app directory, or in the root of our source directory rather. And what we can do here is just apply some very global universal styles. For me, it's just going to be a very simple task of setting the background color of the entire body to a certain place. And now, obviously, as with any sort of global functionality or definition in any code, there's some danger to this, right? So typically, unless it's a smaller scale project, there won't be many defaults. You have to be very selective about what you globally define, right? Because it can really be frustrating, because the entire point, right, of this componentized structure is to keep everything self-contained. So when you're thinking in that paradigm, and then you have these unexpected places where code is coming from, like a global declaration, that can be frustrating. However, it is important to note that this is sometimes quite useful. For example, if you're trying to do something like change the way that links are styled, so maybe you wanted to get rid of the default underline underneath links, that's a good place to do that, the global declaration, because that's something we want on every page, absolutely regardless, right? But do be very careful about what you include here. So now it's a matter of actually creating the data flow. So we're going to be covering, I think, our most difficult, newest information here. A lot of this comes down to just reading documentation, right? Like all of these specific things, it's kind of just TypeScript that we're used to seeing, but in a particular form, right? Like we have these new things here with the @ that we're not really used to seeing unless you're familiar with the decorator pattern. But overall, it's somewhat normal TypeScript. Once we get into RxJS, that is the piece that for me is a little more hard to wrap your head around. It took me a long time personally to just wrap my head around normal promises and asynchronous logic in JavaScript. So having to then kind of relearn it in a new form can be somewhat frustrating. So no worries if this is a lot to jump into, but we're gonna try to get our heads around it. So to create a service, we use the command ng, like before, g, except instead of C for component, we use S for service. I will be naming this our time service. So what is a service in Angular exactly? I've been throwing this word around a lot, but it doesn't really mean that much as of yet to us. A service is essentially a provider of information. So what we're going to be able to do is instantiate a instance of this service and access the same value no matter where we are in the app by accessing it. So it follows what's called a singleton pattern. What that means is that it's a class, but it's a class where like instantiating the class multiple times actually still points to the same class, which is confusing, right? Because that sort of goes against what we imagine classes to be, but it is very useful to sort of be able to bundle these services in that way. And it's sort of fundamental to how they work under the hood. So there is a little bit of a confusing syntax when it comes to integrating services into our Angular code, but it is an extremely powerful and useful system. So we've created the service. We'll see that it shows up here in our app folder. And it's quite a simple file for now. But we're going to be adding a few things. First of all, we need to import the following. We need to import the observable package from RxJS, the timer package from RxJS, as well as the map and share replay packages from RxJS. But here it's actually going to be in the operators, inside of the operators piece of the RxJS library. And then we're going to actually now write the logic for the service. So where does this service's data come from? We're going to define that, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to define a new variable. We're going to make it private. We're going to call it clock. And if you're not familiar with the public-private distinction, essentially what it means is clock, this variable will not be accessible as a property of this class, but within the class's logic, it is able to be thrown around and used as a variable. And this is where the confusing syntax, for me at least, comes in. We will be setting it equivalent to this observable date. Also, the autocomplete there is not even useful, but here we have observable date equals timer 0 1000 dot pipe, and then we're gonna give it an enter there, throw a semicolon at the end, and then we're gonna use a function called map to take the tick and create a new date. And then additionally, we're going to use the share replay function with the option 1. So let's run through what we just did and what this actually means. Also, I'm noticing that there's some error here. I'm not exactly sure why that's happening. It looks pretty normal to me, but I think if we just keep going, it might fix itself. So what are we doing here? We're defining this variable. It's an observable. And basically what we're doing is we're using the timer function on RxJS. What this means is that it's going to send out an update every 1,000 seconds, milliseconds rather. And as you can imagine, that's pretty perfect for a clock application, right? So every 1,000 seconds, we're going to get a quick update. It's going to tell us what time it is again, and we're going to be able to take that value and throw that into our actual website, right? So the one other thing we have to do as well is define this getter method here. And what this is going to do is allow us to actually get the time. So if we use this service, we'll be able to return the time. Oh, right. OK. Accidental semicolon. That was what was causing our little syntax error, our little linting problem. OK. So now we have this service. We have an observable, which, as we've discussed, is essentially going to allow us to react to updates on this stream. So you can think of this as like quite similar to how the event system works in the DOM, right? So what we're going to be able to do on the other side of this observable is when on the component consuming this observable, we'll be able to create a callback which will handle updates from this timer function here. So every 1,000 milliseconds, this service will send out a new note. Hey, this is the time. And then the components will be able to be like, oh, that's the time. All right. And then they'll be able to react to that input, right? So this is sort of like a send receiver model of communication. It's what we would call a push style rather than a pull style, meaning rather than the client initiating data transfer, it will actually be the server. So the client will be reacting to the server's logic rather than the server reacting to the client's, which is great because it allows us to make sure that it's exactly in sync. And you can imagine if we were actually doing something that was across the internet, that's especially useful, right? Like within this app, it's a little bit of an over engineering thing. But if we were actually making requests to another server, this is a super useful structure for those requests to come in. And it allows us to make the logic for reacting to those data flows quite a bit simpler. And we'll see how that happens over back in this clock component. So let's take a look here at the class that we are actually declaring here. We have a constructor, which we haven't really talked about what we're going to use it for. And we have an ng on init function. And now we have this variable. So what the constructor is going to do is we're going to use it to create and instantiate instances of the service that we need. So you'll notice here that we actually don't have this imported quite yet. So I'll import it up at the top. But this is how we take advantage of services, right? So we're going to instantiate it like so and assign it to this variable name based on the import of our actual service. And then what we'll be able to do is consume that service to actually respond to the data. So now that we have time service as a property, what we'll do is we'll just go this dot time service. Notice the underscore to delineate that this is an instance rather of the time service service instead of the actual service itself, right? So that's why we have that underscore there, just to keep that naming convention to make it obvious. And then, and also because we would have variable overlap, right? So then we're going to subscribe to the time property like so. So we have the subscribe function. This is the other side of that relationship I was talking about, right? So now this is as opposed to the server yelling out, this is what time it is. This is the function that's going to make sure that we're listening to what time this service is saying that it is and responding justly, or accordingly rather. And here we're also going to define the type of data that we expect to come in. Once more, just for TypeScript's sake. And then we have this callback function, right? And all we need to do in response is actually set the current time. So we've created this property, the current time, which is displayed. We know it's displayed because we're using this syntax here to inject that data into our HTML. And according to those updates as they come from the service, we will be using this locale time string function to actually convert that into something that we can display on the clock face itself. So let's take a look at where we're at right now. I'm getting one error in my compilation, which is coming from sort of a weird thing in the time service. I need to also put this to the bottom of the page because it's very frustrating. There we go. So yes, here we have this weird thing here that was accidentally imported, I think, due to some autocomplete in VS Code. But if we delete it, now our code is actually compiling. Let's take a look at the output. And there we are. I believe you guys all can see now. This is exactly what we wanted. Our clock app is looking amazing. It's looking fantastic. So now I want to offer a couple opportunities. We're going to be getting into the general Q&A later, where I'll have some time to answer any questions that you have about anything whatsoever, if we have the time. But for now, I want to open up the floor to any questions that you have about what we actually just did in terms of the code, as well as if there's any actual pieces of the code that you guys would want to go over. That is to say, if there was any of the code that I maybe rushed through, or that you guys need some more clarification on. So do you guys, or do you guys all feel confident doing this entire process now? How are you guys feeling? What questions do you guys have? Now is the time. Someone just sent me a direct message asking to explain the code in small portions. Is there any particular pieces of the code that you guys would want to go over? Yeah, it's a little bit fast. Yeah, which files were too fast? I can go over pieces of the code if there's any particular pieces. Yes, I can definitely cover the RxJS operators, as they're called, if that's the biggest thing that people are struggling with. The file extensions, interesting. Okay, so that's quite an easy explanation. So .ts stands for TypeScript, right? So that's this superset of JavaScript that's going to give us the type checking. .scss is for the style sheets. So this is the fancy gussed up version of CSS that we're writing in that gets compiled down into CSS. We also have this dot component. That's just a naming convention, right? That doesn't really affect the type of this file in any way. It's just to indicate that this is all bundled together inside of a component. If we compare it to the files here, for example, where it's just styles.scss, right? It would get confusing if we didn't have any sort of distinguishing naming conventions to talk about all the different kinds of style sheets, all the different kinds of, TypeScript files, et cetera, that we have. So I hope that cleared up a little bit of what these file extensions are. And now to pipe. So the way that RxJS works is it provides a lot of really useful operators. Let me actually get up the operator documentation. I often find that it's much more useful to just actually go on the documentation and work through it together than for me to try to stumble through my understanding of it. But essentially, what we're doing in RxJS is we can transform these data streams in a way, right? So we have this data stream that we've created using the timer function. We know that this data stream is essentially going to consist of one date object being sent over this observable every 1,000 milliseconds, right? So basically, this timer is, you can think of it, a stream of numbers, essentially, right? So it's essentially just going to go, it's going to count off for the, it's going to count off for us. It's a function that goes 1, 2, 3. That's literally all this timer function does. It's an observable that's going to go 1, 2, 3, 1 every second. It's literally going to tell us a number. Then the pipe function is going to allow us to transform this very meaningless stream, right? And actually, instead of just returning numbers, return dates, which with every tick. So that's what this map function is doing, right? It's going to take a certain value, which is coming out of the timer observable right now, excuse me, right now, and transform it into a date object, replace it with a new date object, which is going to be the current date by default. And then the share replay operator is essentially just going to be like, and now push, right? So now send off this data that we've created, and also send off the previous frame, right? So basically what this is doing is allowing us to make sure that there's never any confusion about what time it is and what time it was, right? So we know what the value was 1 frame ago as well as now. So we can just have both of those pieces of information, right? So it's going to basically keep our 2 observables in sync. I can actually go to, if that's not a sufficient explanation, I can send you guys a link to actually understand. But essentially, it's going to allow us to avoid side effects becoming a problem, right? So in this case, it actually probably is a bit overkill, but in complicated situations where there's multiple components subscribing to the same value, you need to kind of be able to keep track of how this observable has been acting and interacting. But it's actually not 100% necessary for this use case, probably. Someone is asking again what services are. So this is a service, like I said, and it's basically just going to provide data. In this case, we are providing an observable. So we have this data that is in the form of an observable, in the form of these streams that we've been talking about that we can create using the RxJS library. And we're able to set up a sort of really clear relationship between data changing and the UI responding, right? So the data that's changing here is this piece of data, right? The date, what this service claims the date is the only thing that's changing throughout the state of this application, throughout the life cycle of this application. And as that happens with each second that ticks off, this service will provide a different value. RxJS allows us to, and I'm combining this with someone else's question which is, what is RxJS, right? We're going to be able to transform this into a reactive process. So what that means is, instead of having to handle the logic from the server, from the client side, so right, instead of having to run some sort of timer on the client side that makes a request every 1 second to ask what time it is, instead we can react to changes. So as the data changes, we automatically run a callback, which handles whatever app logic needs to run to keep the UI in sync with our app's state, with our app's data, right? And And that's what this subscribe function is for here. So that's the final step. So we're setting up this service, we're setting up this observable, and then here we're subscribing to its changes. So subscribing is essentially attaching a callback to updates on this RxJS observable, right? So every time that timer function takes off a number and sends a new date to this component, this line of code is running. It's setting the current time to this string, to a string, which when we look at the actual clock application, is when we look at the clock application, and let me go back to my VS Code now for this example. Whoops, just shared my whole screen instead of the actual VS Code. If we look at the VS Code, we can see it here, right? We're subscribing and accepting this data through an arrow function and running this line of code here. So we are attaching a callback to changes in the data of the application, if that makes sense. And the service is one half of that functionality. So the service is actually handling the data and how the data changes, and the component is using the subscribe function to sort of connect to that data source and replying to it using this callback that it defines right here. So we're changing the actual state of this component, we would call it, and updating it in accordance to this stream of data. We would generally use services whenever we need to consistently consume a source of data. So you can imagine, for example, that I might need to have a piece of my application that will handle logging in, right? So it's going to log in, and then it's going to need to handle updates from the server about what's going on. So maybe, oh, like, yeah, we're authenticated now. Here is the token that we're going to store in the browser, et cetera, et cetera. You can maybe imagine, if you've worked on an actual web app at scale before, all the kinds of things that this could be useful for. So we can keep the UI in sync with any data from the backend. So anytime we would like to have a source of data that impacts the UI, we can use a service. So is there any other questions? I hope I helped to clarify what people were wondering about RxJS and all these other pieces. Yeah, exactly. So Salim said when we use APIs, for example, that's an extremely great use case for services. So whenever we need to reach out, handle the data coming in from an API, we can expose that information using a service. So we can write the logic to actually reach out to the API in the service, then connect that service to a component to actually handle the response from the service and update the UI accordingly. The app is deployed in the cloud. So the nice thing about these kinds of frameworks is that they are largely client side. So for the most part, you would actually be essentially serving some sort of bundle. So you wouldn't have necessarily to actually run a backend unless you wanted to, right? But this doesn't actually have to have a backend. I could host this on a very simple server that really just serves this bundle of code as we would call it. Unfortunately, MongoDB is far beyond the scope of this. I'm not seeing any super urgent questions at the moment. All right, so I'm going to take a little break. My colleague is going to take back over and talk to you guys a little bit more about the actual courses that you can find on eduonix.com to continue building on this information that we've covered today. Once that's done, I'm going to come right back and we'll do another Q&A section where we will broaden the scope of the questions and you guys can ask just about anything you want to ask. So up until now, we've only been talking about the actual code. Once I'm back from this little break, we will be able to touch on anything you guys want to talk about in web development or any sort of development, code, tech stuff at large. So stick around. Thank you guys so much for being attentive so far, and I will be right back.
Thank you, Gray. Really, really helpful. Okay, I'll just share the screen quickly, and I'll just help all of you guys. Thank you for staying around and listening patiently to Gray, as well as listening to me as well. He'll be just back in a minute. He just have a sip of water, quick break, and he'll be back. Uh, for the ones who have actually been stuck around with me, thank you. I'll actually just introduce you. Some of you had questions which need to be covered extensively, which needs a lot of comprehensive knowledge, basically needs a little more time, which we can't cover in this short session, which is going to be just for a 90-minute session. So understanding this aspect, we actually have come up, Eduonix has already come up with something called as a live training, wherein we are actually opening our seats for people who are interested to go ahead, learn this Angular e-degree. So as you can see on the screen right now, it's actually an in-depth course, which is going to be a weekend only session. So each weekend, you're going to be actually having these courses, this 2-hour journey every Saturday and Sunday, starting 3rd of April. So it's about 10 days from now. You should 10 or 12 days from now. This should start off, and of course, we have global industry experts who are going to be taking care of this. So whatever you are going to learn is actually going to be shared by an experienced instructor. Her name is Arti. She's not available today on our session, but Gray, as Gray has also been there as a part of Eduonix instructor panel, he is also pretty much there for us to help us out. But yeah, coming back to the Angular e-degree, just let me give you a little bit more about what things are going to be shaping up in case you are eager to register yourself. As I mentioned before, these are exclusive 50 seats which are available, and I think we close to about more than 50%, which is already being registered on the website. But yeah, these are the few key highlights wherein people who are worried about what happens after the course, what will happen, will there be a so we do provide recommendations. We do provide a proper industry verified certification. Then there is of course guidance. You have a real-time projects to work on, which are actually being reviewed by our experts. So that's the best part about this. Just a few things about the tools which are covered in this upcoming session, which is going to be starting off on the 3rd. No, okay. So I see there are a bit of comments coming on the chat. So Sid, I'm not sure about why you can't hear me, but I'm sure most of us can hear me clearly. Um, Salim, just to answer your questions, I will share the registration link, which will give you all the details about what you can expect from the upcoming session. So without taking much time, yeah, just one more thing. Industry projects. I just had a chance to go through what all is going to be covered in the upcoming session. So these are a few industry projects which are going to be covered in the upcoming session. By the way, let me be very clear to you that the link will be shared with you during this session as well, while we wait for Gray to come back, as well as there is a free giveaway from Eduonix to acknowledge you participating in today's session. So, something which you can take away for free with you lifelong. You can keep it on your Eduonix dashboard forever, learn through it whenever you like. That's just like one giveaway which we are giving out as well. So just we'll just check with Gray. Are you back, Gray?
Hi, yes, I am.
All right, super. So we'll not take much of the time of our audience. We'll hand it over back to you. Guys, I'm sure Gray will be happy to answer all the questions if we have. Gray, I'll stop my screen share and let's continue.
All right, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for hanging on with us. So today we have covered a few of the fundamentals of what makes Angular tick. There's obviously a lot more to cover. There's so much more depth here in terms of what Angular can do and in terms of how you can do that in Angular. But these are just some of the basic mechanics that we really need to be familiar with, right? Some of the basic fundamental building blocks of how Angular projects are built from the ground up, right? Components, services, observables, all of these different pieces sort of come together to form Angular applications and how they function. So now I want to open the floor to any sort of questions whatsoever. I'm not actually the course trainer for the live training. Someone asked in the chat, I'm not the course trainer for this live training coming up. But I promise you it is an exceptionally nice class if you guys want to sign up for that. I think it is well worth your time. But yes, let's like hop into this question session. What do you guys want to know? We can talk about anything whatsoever. We can talk about maybe other things about Angular, different web frameworks, pros, cons, things of this nature. Anything that really I have knowledge on, I am super happy to share. So in terms of Angular versions, is it incumbent to migrate your application to the latest version each time there is a new release? So one of the interesting things about Angular is that there's, like I said, this sort of duality. Although the original Angular JS is essentially deprecated at this point, there are a lot of different versions of Angular. And as with most things, as with most pieces of software and libraries, they have less and more stable releases. Obviously, you should update Angular whenever there's some feature that Angular is adding that is a compelling change for you. I don't think in any case, in any application, there's an absolute necessity to upgrade everything as soon as it comes out, unless, of course, there's some sort of security vulnerability that's super urgent to fix. So yes, I recommend that you migrate applications when there's breaking changes, when there's a huge security problem you need to fix, or when there's a feature in the newest version that's helpful to you and will make your project better. Is the Angular version is the latest Angular version still using a virtual DOM? Now that's a technical implementation detail I'm actually not that familiar with, but I would assume so. I don't know how feasible it would be to write a performant web framework nowadays without taking advantage of a virtual DOM. For MeanStack, do you server side? These are questions I actually don't know the answer to. I would recommend that you reach out and chat. Eduonix might be able to clarify that question for you. For context, Ranjith asked if we cover server-side pagination, socket.io, WebSocket scheduling, and MongoDB aggregations in the course that we were talking about. And a question from YouTube, is Angular used to create mobile apps? So yeah, actually, as I touched on earlier, one of the compelling features of Angular and of these more modern day frameworks in general, so that is to say Vue, React, Angular, I guess not Vue at this point, but React and Angular, is that they have these ecosystems for native applications. So these these libraries that allow us to essentially serve websites as native applications with native-like features. The way that we would do that in Angular is a library called Ionic. And it's really powerful, right? Because it allows us to have one code base that serves both our mobile users, our web users, and even can create desktop applications that run natively. Now, obviously, when we're talking about running web applications natively, it is sort of a hack together solution. We're not going to get the exact same native performance that we would expect from something written in .NET, for example. But it is an effective strategy, and a lot of companies are taking Ionic super seriously. And not just Ionic, but also React Native, which is the React equivalent. Which brings us to the next question, Angular versus React. So I think there are really strong arguments on both sides, really. It comes down mostly to what you're most comfortable with. They're both quite performant. I don't think any developer can really seriously claim that either of these libraries is substantially, meaningfully superior to the other, except in particular use cases, right? So I can't universally say Angular React is better. What I can say is that I prefer React. But that has more to do with my own personal opinions on how I like configuring my tooling, how I like to develop applications. Angular sort of has a more coherent, much more opinionated system for managing all of these sort of configuration level things like the routing and etc. Whereas React is a little more freeform, gives you a little more flexibility to piece things together yourself and really define all of that how you'd like. What is the difference between Angular and React? Feature-wise, sort of basically what I just explained. Performance-wise, there isn't a significant difference. In terms of the learning curve, I personally actually found Angular easier to learn. I assume because, like I said, it comes with these more sensible defaults and has one coherent documentation set as a result. So it's nice to have that one reference website. Someone asked me to pull my hair back. Yeah. So we have this one reference website that really tells us how to do our routing, how to do all of these things, because they're all developed and maintained by the same people, which is quite useful. Someone asked if this recording will be available. Absolutely, this recording will be available. It is all of the resources from this lecture that we use will be available to you after the course, so that you guys can really see, take advantage of the materials today and review them at your leisure. Looking at the frequent versioning of Angular, is it still the best to use for a long-term e-commerce project? So just frequent versioning is actually somewhat promising for, depending on the context, right? Frequent versioning could mean that it's a super early release candidate that isn't stable yet, but it can also mean that it's just developing quickly and is super responsive. They also do have long-term support versions, which are have a little bit longer of a life cycle. So I think Angular is very viable for long-term projects. Are the NG services singletons? Yes, they are. Exactly. At what level must we reach JavaScript to be able to understand Angular perfectly? You just need to understand every concept that you apply, right? Like, obviously, you don't need to know the implementation details of the event loop or like how JS is compiled, but you should understand the syntax. You should understand the fundamental pieces of how JavaScript works and etc. You should be somewhat fluent in JavaScript. Can we code Angular on Android? So like I said, it's sort of a hack together solution, but you can use Ionic to export native versions, which are kind of like glorified containers, but which actually work well. Is Microsoft taking over Angular? That's not something I'm familiar with. I really don't think so. Angular is maintained by Google, as far as I understand. If Microsoft is taking over Angular, that would surprise me. But I haven't heard that. All right, I think that's all the questions I see. So unless there's any more, I will pass it on to Vivek.
Yes, thanks for being so patient and answering all the questions. Great. It's always been lovely to have a webinar with you. So guys, while we wait for a few more questions to come through in, I would like to just reiterate that we have our recorded sessions as well as the PPT and the resources which are used by Gray. These will be added to the Eduonix dashboard in the next 24 hours. So do not worry, even if you have missed anything or if you want to go at your own pace, don't worry, you can just wait for the next 24 hours. Our backend team will ensure that it is updated on our Eduonix dashboard panel. Yeah, I think great. I think there's about a couple of questions. I'll just unmute if you can take it up.
Yes, absolutely. So the first one I'm seeing, um, I was able to start working on an Angular application with very minimal learning, but with React, it kept adding concepts one after the other, and I was totally confused with what concepts I should be covering. Yes, so with Angular, it like I said, it has these very sensible defaults, and since you have this very clear set of softwares and libraries, you can really work through the Angular system, as it were, in a way. With React, you sort of have to figure these things out for yourself. But I would recommend, if you're confused, find someone online, either on Medium, YouTube, any of these websites, who's built a whole website, and see how they're configuring their React application. See what libraries they use to pull all the pieces together, and familiarize yourself with those and see if they work for you, and replace what doesn't work for you with other things. Would you want to use a WebSocket instead of making an HTTP request using fetch? So that depends. Do you need real-time support? If you do, you should probably use socket. In the case of this application, that's a good point. We'd probably more realistically use WebSockets if we were to have a separated backend. But then again, having a separated backend for a simple clock application is pretty ridiculous. But yeah, Socket.io would probably be a better option, or WebSockets rather, which for those who don't know is just a real-time communication system that sort of keeps the connection open, instead of being really, one connection and then response. It's more continuous. Why choose Angular? You choose Angular because you want to create a project with Angular, right? If there's a single page web application that you feel is too complex to take on without a web framework, you should probably choose one of these web frameworks. And we've sort of outlined the comparison between React and Angular. I think React and Angular are the two primary ones that people consider nowadays. And if you prefer the Angular ecosystem over the React one, you should go with it. Can I explain about ng tag and HTML? All right, we're getting sort of towards the end here, so I'll answer this one last question and then hand it back over to my colleague. But these are called Angular directives. Sorry, I just realized this was a direct message. So Faz asked, can I explain about ng tags in HTML? For example, the ng-container, ng-template. So we didn't really cover directives in this in this workshop, but essentially directives allow us to react to data and sort of create responsive templates. So for example, we have an ng-for directive. You are probably used to interacting with HTML and setting HTML properties on, or attributes on, elements. And sort of in a similar way, we can use Angular directives to actually instruct our component to create new HTML in a sort of dynamic way. So we have this ng for loop, which is going to allow us to generate multiple copies of the same component by iterating through something, and things like that. And this is sort of a hard thing to explain without an example. So I'll just go ahead and share the Angular directives link in the chat and let you guys check that out for yourselves if that wasn't a clear enough explanation for you. But Angular directives are definitely something that you should check out. So thank you guys. You guys have been an absolutely amazing audience today. I really appreciate you all for coming, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Grave. You've been so patient and so nice to each and everyone, and every time in your session. I personally love it as well, guys. Okay, quickly, I see that there are a lot of questions which we have uh, with regards to what we have learned as well. What we can do here is, as Eduonix, we can provide you with a session wherein you will be able to get answers to all your questions. So I'll just share my screen. I've just shared a link on the chat right now. Quickly have a look at that registration link and quickly enroll yourself, because there are limited seats. By the way, if you're seeing the screen, you'll be able to see we also have a certificate at the end of the live training session, which is going to start off on the 3rd of April. Guys, quickly, I wanted to won't take much time, but wanted to inform you that we have 19 seats as the webinar started. So we had over 31 people who have already enrolled for the class. The best part about this is why I'm asking you to do it right now is we have a spot bonus. Um, you know, not only actually getting, if you check the website right now, you actually will see that the offer is not available on the website. It's $99. And if you're availing this code, it knocks off the $9. It gets you at $90. Plus, there's a skill bundle which gets added to your Eduonix dashboard after your purchase, which is worth $48. Guys, this is a definitely rock bottom price, which we're giving away for free. Now, that's one good deal. That's the reason why I'm actually offering you this as a spot bonus for an immediate booking. So, guys, just put it on the chat once you have enrolled. I'll ask my backend team quickly to have a check and ensure everything that's promised goes right away into your Eduonix dashboard. Uh, your as I mentioned, your questions with regards to all your career guidance, your job placements, your requests for questions, if you haven't understood, yes, Gray is not a part of the instructor panel, which is going to be taking who's going to be taking part care of this upcoming session. It's going to be Arti, who is equally experienced, and she's again a fun person to learn as you have experienced with Gray as well. So I'll quickly just open the chat. I see that. Okay. Mohammed says, can you give me the deal because I have purchased it before the session? Mohammed, I would recommend if you can just write to me quickly on this email address. I'll have a quick look at this. It's vivek.prabhu at eduonix.com. Okay. Please, I would request you to write to me on this email address, and I'll just share it with the relevant team to get in touch with you. Do not worry. What I would suggest for the rest is, at the moment, please ensure that you inform me on the chat once you have made the purchase, so I can also ensure that you are immediately getting the promised goodies along with this. So one more time, I'm just sharing the registration link quickly, guys. Open this link first. Tell me if you're able to open the link and if you're able to enroll it. Sai says, I see the total price is 90. Yes, I have added the coupon code which you see already here. WebAng90 is the code. I've already added it. It should show $90. And on the website, without the code, it will show you 99. Plus, you won't be getting the spot offer which is being offered to you on this webinar. Guys, okay, in the meantime, while we wait for you to just put it on the chat, I'd like to personally thank, on behalf of Eduonix and myself, a big thank you to Gray for being such a lovely host and lovely instructor throughout this session and the series of the sessions which we've been doing together. The from the audience as well as from Eduonix, a big thank you to Gray for spending time, especially on a Sunday. It's kind of a task, I'm sure. But Gray, if you have any particular feedback or any suggestions or anything you'd like to say, you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you guys for just being such a fantastic group. If you would like to follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I'm always available to talk about anything technology. I have shared my socials in the chat once already, but I'll do it once more before I sign off for good. I hope you all have a great day, and thank you so much, for Vivek, for being such a fantastic host.
My pleasure, Gray. It's always fun to work with you, always, as always. Okay, a couple of questions people were asking me with regards to, okay, Alasan, if I've got that name right, sorry. I am going to give away the free giveaway course as well as a part of you being such a lovely audience. Just allow me like 10 seconds. Ryan, you made the purchase. Perfect. I'll just share the details, your details, and I'll ask the backend team to get the things which are promised as well. Sai, I'm not sure if I got the question correct. This is the one which we are talking about starting on the third is a paid course, and the course actually gives you a freebie which is worth $48. So you're paying less than half if what you see it on the website. So that's about it. Yeah, you can always have a look at the chat for Gray's contact in case you would like to stay in touch on Twitter and LinkedIn. Is the giveaway, Ivan says, is the giveaway the discount code or do we get something else? No, Ivan, it's actually a free giveaway course, which is for each and every one of you. Yeah, please. Also, after this session, you will be also receiving an email which will ask you for a feedback for Eduonix workshops which we conduct. So I would like to have you guys to, Ryan, of course, I have made a note of it. I will share it with you. So quickly, as I promised, I'm sharing the free giveaway. Please make sure you enroll for this. There's no paid commitments required for the free giveaway as promised by me. Yes, and for the registration, please make sure you follow this link quickly. And okay, one last thing is, in case you are not comfortable taking a spot decision, I am ready to extend the last. Okay, I see Ryan has made a purchase, so I'm assuming we're left with 18 seats at the moment. So for the 18 seats, I'm dropping an email to each of you to ensure that you are able to make the purchase within the next 48 hours. Okay, this I'm sure is going to be sold out because we just left with 18. Okay. um See, Ivan, if you're already doing this Python e-degree, it's completely your call. I am not the industry expert, to be honest, to guide you on this. But if you have any difficulty or any questions, you can always reach out on the support chat on eduonix.com website. You can put the same question there. The team will be able to guide you a little better. Also, make sure that you are logging on to your email mailboxes to access your mails. Check the same offer in case you're not able to make a spot decision. I will try and ensure that you also get that the free bundle which I'm talking about. uh, okay, Ivan, thank you, welcome. Okay, Akhil says quick and easy guide to Node and Express coupon shows error. I'm not sure why it shows an error. uh, Okay, let's do with this one. I'm sharing the free giveaway link once again, last time, and the registration link as well quickly. Guys, we have just one last minute. Let's respect everyone's time. We're already over the 90 minutes as we had planned for today. So, guys, quickly let me know if you have made a purchase, and if you have any comments for me, for Gray, just drop them on the chat box, and of course on the feedback, which is going to be on your email as well. All right, thank you. Thank you for your comment, Alasan. Guys, okay, I presume that we are good for the day and we have enjoyed today's session. Please make sure you leave your comments on the feedback and make the best of this opportunity. Since you're not able to make any spot decision, I have shared the email. It should be in your mailbox in another 15 minutes. All right. Thank you so much. And we will end this session in another 10 seconds. Thank you so much. And really appreciate all your comments, your feedback. Thank you, Gray. You have a great day ahead. Thank you.